Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Kemcho, said President Obama when he met Mr. Modi last night. Thank you, Mr. President, said the Indian Prime Minister in return. Was that the propitious start of a new relationship? And has Mr. Modi been able to work the same charm on American CEOs whose investment India is seeking? Joining me to try and answer those questions is the well-known foreign policy analyst C. Raja Mohan, the former president of CII and vice chairman of Ashok Leyland R. Sheshasai, and the senior writer of India Today, Jyoti Malhotra. Professor Raja Mohan, the American scholar Ashley Tellis, in a recent article for the Carnegie Endowment, has described Indo-US relations as a faltering partnership. Writing in the Economic Times just about a few days ago, Swaminathan Iyer says that what's needed is a damage repair job. So how hard or difficult is the task that faces the two heads of government who've just begun talking at the White House literally 5 minutes ago?
I think Prime Minister Modi has largely succeeded in rekindling the romance with the United States, because what started in 2005 on great expectations after the nuclear deal steadily eroded in the last few years on every count, on international cooperation, business, strategic, on every dimension. What I think Modi has done, I think, is to revive that agenda, to give commitments that, look, India is ready under him to pick up the ball and to run with it.
You know, you said he's succeeded in rekindling the romance. Do you really mean to put it as strongly as that? I mean, he certainly created a huge impression on American Indians in New York and on Indians in India watching that performance at Madison Square Garden. But has it had the same magnetic impact on Americans themselves?
Look, I think the results, you'll have to wait. But what he has done is that, look, he's saying India is ready to deal with all the issues, be allowed to become contentious. He's saying, look, I'm ready to engage, whether it's climate change, nuclear, military cooperation. He's saying, look, I'm back here, I'm ready to engage. He's giving that promise, and what his government has to deliver in the next few weeks and months.
So it's Obama's response to Modi's willingness that will be the key that determines whether the relationship changes or not?
No, the Americans have been ready for quite some time. It was we who turned our back, and Modi is changing that from the UPA government.
Jyoti Malhotra, in the joint editorial done by the two together for the Washington Post, which was released this morning, they say the true potential of our relationship has yet to be fully realized. The advent of a new government in India is a natural opportunity to broaden and deepen our relationship. That being the case, and given the sort of willingness that you've heard Professor Raja Mohan describe, what are the chances of success? Or will it take several meetings over months, maybe even a year or so, before the relationship can go back to the high point it had reached in the first 10 years, the first 5 years of this century?
I think the joint sort of editorial or report in the Washington Post, by the way, it's the web edition of the Washington Post, it's not the print edition.
It could appear in the print edition tomorrow, possibly.
Well, we're already in that morning, so
I mean tomorrow meaning the next day.
The next morning. Inshallah, as they say. But I think the fact that both Barack Obama and Narendra Modi have come together to put their names down on this joint report is interesting, because I think it's clearly both America and Barack Obama have moved on from the Narendra Modi of 2002. The fact that they invited him to Washington, D.C.
What about the chances of success at this meeting itself, or is it going to take several such meetings over months and years before we see the relationship go back?
I think there is considerable chance of success. I think they will talk not only rhetoric, but there will be real action as well. I think in the Indians, for example, I think the Indians will most likely promise to buy more defense goods from America. But listen, I don't think it's a transactional relationship, and I think that's what Modi is trying to do. So he's wooing the American CEOs. He met 11 of them. Now, that's one part of his agenda, which is to say, listen, I'm going to lay out the red carpet for you, so please come and make in India. Of course, the CEOs will say...
I'll come to CEOs in a moment's time. Let's just stick to the politicians first. I'll broaden it to the CEOs in a moment.
I think Barack Obama wants to do business not only with Modi, but he wants to do business with India. They want to move some of the money that the Americans have invested in China. They want to move it to India. I think there is keenness not only to make a friendship with Modi, but a keenness to have some sort of a partnership with India and with Japan. So I think this Japan, India, US sort of relationship, I hate to call it a trilateral or an alliance because it's not, but it could be the beginnings of something.
Mr. Shesasai, there is a view, and it was expressed yesterday on this program by Surjit Bhalla, but many others have voiced the same sort of opinion, that in fact Indo-US relations can only return to that high point somewhere around 2005-2006 when the Indian economy gets back to performing at levels above 7% growth. In other words, the economy is the engine that drives this relationship. Do you subscribe to that view?
Yeah, broadly, yes. But let's put it this way. I think, India as a product was launched in 2005-06. I won't say the product bombed, but it hasn't been a runaway success. So I think it's getting relaunched now very effectively by the Prime Minister. So we've got to now make sure that this product performs. So the American investors are not strangers to India, and they have to see that the experience when the rubber hits the road, the experience that they have is going to be sound. And what does that mean? That means that there is going to be growth in the market, there's going to be money to be made, there's going to be simplicity of operations, there are hassles to conduct business here in India. All of that have to come together, and it can only happen when the economy is growing and we're able to deliver results. So I think we just have to wait for this second launch to be successful.
Let me put this to you. I was talking a moment ago before the commercial break to the American scholar Ashley Tellis, who made it very clear that whilst Americans are interested in investing in India, their biggest obstacle is the belief that has emerged over the last 2 years that commitments made by the Indian state cannot be relied upon. They look, for instance, at the way the Supreme Court scrapped 122 2G licenses at one go 2 years ago, or 214 coal blocks just 2 weeks ago. They look at the retrospective tax amendments made by UPA, which have not been notably reversed or revoked by this government. And then they look at the way this government has reneged on the UPA's commitment to the WTO over the trade facilitation agreement, and they say, can we rely on the Indian government not to change the rules of the game once we become participants? Are we endangering our money? And he said very clearly that Americans would want to see fundamental policy enactments giving them assurance, and they will only wait either till the end of the fiscal year or till the next budget, which is, by the way, just 6 months. And if in those 6 months Mr. Modi hasn't delivered, then they will believe that even if a man with the support and mandate that Mr. Modi has can't turn things around, then the future is bleak. Now, can Mr. Modi deliver so quickly? And if he can't, do you share that concern of Ashley Tellis that the window will close for American CEOs?
Yes and no. I think to some extent we have very little time. The stakes have been raised, and therefore we have to deliver, and the structural changes have to be made, and the government has no more than perhaps another 2 quarters to at least initiate these structural changes. And if we don't do it, we're not going to be living up to the promises that have been made by no less a person than the Prime Minister. So certainly there is pressure on, and I think this pressure has been consciously brought on by the Prime Minister himself. That's certainly true. Having said that, I also think that today, for other geopolitical reasons, India has become certainly much more important than it has been the last few years for the United States. And given that, the US business trial almost always works in tandem with the policy directive of the US government. They're not in very explicit terms, but they get very easily aligned. So if there is going to be a favored nation status for India for whatever geopolitical reasons, you will find that there is going to be a greater degree of forbearance on the part of US business, and therefore to some extent the geopolitical compulsions and the logic of that is going to give us a little more breather. Okay. And US business is used to the swings and roundabouts. They've seen that in China, and then I think there could be therefore some degree of forbearance for India as well. But I think the fact is that yes, we have raised the stakes, we've got to deliver, and we don't have too long to do that. And we must make sure that the geopolitical logic is not in any manner disturbed.
Okay. The end of Mr. Sheshasai's answer, in fact, perhaps that whole middle bit, links up economics to politics. And that, in a sense, brings the focus back to the two men sitting probably at this moment in the Oval Office, starting their one-to-one before they meet his delegates. Let's come to some of the issues Mr. Modi will want to raise with the American president. For instance, how forcefully do you think he's going to bring up his concern about the speed of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan? Yesterday at the Council for Foreign Relations, he made a point of saying that his advice to America is slow down your withdrawal, you risk repeating Iraq. And you know and I know that if that isn't slowed down, by January American troop levels will be down to 10,000. In 2 years' time they could be down to 0. We're worried about destabilization in Afghanistan and the terror blowback. But will the American president heed the Indian Prime Minister's advice, slow it down?
Look, I don't think we can keep the Americans in Afghanistan if their politics can't bear it. So I think he's committed to 2 more years. He's president only for 2 more years. So what do we do in the 2 years? Do we expand intelligence sharing? Do we expand more cooperation? Do we help each other in Afghanistan? That is the issue. It's not telling, look, don't leave Afghanistan. Look, he's going to decide on the basis of his domestic considerations. So I think what
Can I interrupt and ask you this? Can intelligence sharing and any other level of cooperation centered around Afghanistan take care of India's concerns, A, of destabilization of that country, and B, the blowback of terror? Because that's Mr. Modi's focus.
Look, I think exactly. Look, earlier, decade ago, when this came into Afghanistan, they used to tell us, look, don't do too many things, Pakistanis are getting upset. But today we're in a very different situation. Because the Americans today see, look, they're no longer dependent on Pakistan. The blowback from Pakistan affects them. So I think there is a much more of a common ground today, because both of us are today far more vulnerable than we were a decade ago. And let me just finish that point. A decade ago, what Bush gave us was a gift. And next 5 years he spent looking the gift horse in the mouth. But today Americans are much weaker force because they're facing challenges in the Middle East, in China and Asia. For India too, the environment is far more complicated today. Our growth is down. So I think today we need each other a lot more than we did 10 years ago.
There's no doubt we need each other a lot more than 10 years ago. But there's a third factor in the equation that we can't forget, and that's Pakistan. And the reason I mention it, as America starts to withdraw from Pakistan, it will need cooperation from not just the Pakistan government, but critically the Pakistan army. And many believe in India that could change the way America looks on Pakistan's involvement in terror. But we believe Pakistan to be the epicenter of terror. Is there a danger that as America withdraws from Afghanistan and its dependence on Pakistan increases, Pakistan could become an issue of concern between Washington and Delhi?
I think, Karan, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think Modi is going to say this exact same thing to Obama. It's not as if Barack Obama doesn't understand what you're saying. But I think the American dependence on Pakistan is so huge, despite the fact that they're trying other alternatives, via Central Asia. And they've even begun to talk to the Iranians behind the parda, if you like. Having said that, so I think, in the past, the Americans were not willing to look at the sort of the Pakistan army wanting to sort of destabilize, if you like, Afghanistan. But I think things are changing, and the reason I say that is that John Kerry was actually instrumental in getting Abdullah to join the unity government. Which is now, you have Ashraf Ghani as president.
As chief executive, an undefined role.
And my understanding is that John Kerry understood that there was huge fraud and that actually Abdullah would have stood a much better chance. And I think a year from now, there will be another election in Afghanistan. And I think the Americans will be willing to put their money where their mouth is. And
Can I interrupt into this too?
Sure.
What you seem to be suggesting to me is that while the talks happen, and whilst the two sides are keen to converge, 2 elephants in the room, not just one, are Afghanistan, what happens to Afghanistan and the terror that blows back to us, and Pakistan and our fear and concern that America's dependence on Pakistan could change the way America looks at Pakistan-sponsored terror. Those are 2 elephants in the room, and both sides are aware of them, but there's not an awful lot they can do.
No, I don't agree with you on that one, because I think Obama will tell Modi, listen, you have to do much more. This is your neighborhood. So if you want to be the big boy or the big power in the neighborhood, then you have to make amends and come to some sort of an understanding with Pakistan. So I think if you notice
push Modi to open talks at a level and at a time he's not willing to do.
But Karan, I think Modi is already doing that. At the UNGA speech, his first remarks were that मैं पाकिस्तान के साथ मित्रता चाहता हूँ. I want friendship with Pakistan.
And he rose above Nawaz Sharif. He didn't descend to his level.
I think so. And so I think on Afghanistan also, to quickly end, I think the Indians will do much more now that there is a president and there is a CEO, Abdullah, who's an old friend of India. And India is willing, with the Russians, willing to do much more in Afghanistan.
We're talking, Mr. Shesasai, if I can use that colorful metaphor, about elephants in the Oval Office as the Indian Prime Minister and the American President get down to talks. And whether these are growing elephants or shrinking elephants is another matter. But do you think the WTO and India's refusal to sign the trade facilitation agreement could be a third possible elephant in that room, looking over the shoulder of the two men? Or do you see hope in the possibility, and maybe it's just press speculation, nothing more, that the Americans or the WTO as a whole could agree to expanding the peace clause from a 4-year clause into a permanent clause, which could take care of the concerns about India's food security, about which the Prime Minister spoke so forcefully yesterday at the Council for Foreign Relations?
Yes, I think the WTO issue is going to be quite a thorn in the flesh. The American investors, American business would certainly look at India with great interest, and clearly the American political system is going to look at India with great interest. But let's not be under any illusion that we are going to be doing trade and business, or we're going to be doing politics with the US on our terms. It's got to be done, perhaps not entirely on US terms, but it's got to be, the needle has got to go pretty much towards looking at the terms that are being set for us. So I think it's whether it is in WTO, whether it is in relation to the Afghan issue or the Pak issue, I think we need to be alive to the fact that that US will expect greater degree of alignment from India to their policy. I mean, US has been known to say either you are with us or you're against us. So I think those kind of dynamics are not going to fundamentally change, and we must not have any illusions about it.
Absolutely, and in fact it's that belief that America is willing to do trade and business but on its terms that brings me to the nuclear issue. America had great hopes and expectations that they would get 10,000 megawatts worth of nuclear contracts from India. They certainly did all the heavyweight getting us through the Indo-US nuclear deal, although they're not showing the same alacrity when it comes to getting us into the other 4 bodies. We've got a nuclear liability law that has frustrated them. Some people say it's actually annoyed them. Can Mr. Modi make any concessions there? Because we're talking about a national act.
Look, I think it's not just with the US. I think we made a god-awful mess with the Liability Act. After spending 34 years outside the nuclear cooperation system.
The Russians and the French don't like it either.
Even our own domestic sector has a problem. So I think the challenge is, look, how do you get beyond this point? I mean, there is an act of parliament.
What's your answer to that challenge?
My sense is, look, I think they're going to explore, they've already explored some options of interpreting the rules.
That hasn't worked with anyone so far.
Let's see. I mean, I think there'll be more that can be done, and I think that's what they're going to try and do. But the more important thing
You're ruling out amending the liability
I think that will be the last act. I mean, I think there's a lot that can be done before that. But I think this whole thing of Americans supporting pressure, we have to deal with them on their terms, it's always going to be pressure. I mean, I don't buy this. Look, Americans are deal makers. Now, we've been saying, look, either this or not this. So I think if we get into I think I prefer a transactional relationship that on WTO, on climate change, on IPR, what Mr. Modi has signaled for the last week is that, look, there is flexibility in India's position. We're willing to split the difference. We're ready to engage and find possible common ground on what issues that have been presented as impossible.
And you believe that's a line of logic that the Americans understand and will respond to?
That's what's reflected in the joint op-ed today.
Let me bring up with you, Jyoti, another issue. ISIL and the international concert of countries that the president is putting together is very important to him. He's probably made it a personal initiative. He took it up at the UN very, very strongly. Our Prime Minister, both in his speech at the UN and then more importantly at his more considered speech to the Council of Foreign Relations yesterday, spoke at great length about terror, the need for the world to unite, the need for the world not to divide between good and bad terror, and how terror was everyone's priority. And in fact, if I read correctly, this joint statement that they've issued, this editorial, talks about how India and the United States are bound by common values and mutual interests. Having said all of that, can we resist an American plea, join us at least morally in the concert of nations against ISIL? Because at the moment, the Prime Minister doesn't mention ISIL. He talks about terror, but ISIL isn't mentioned. Is that going to be a problem for Mr. Modi?
No, I think you have your answer. I think the fact that on all these occasions that you just spoke about, Mr. Modi has refused to sort of come on board formally answers your question, which is that while India has huge stakes in the anti-terror global campaign, I think he will not formally join on. And perhaps he will tell Mr. Obama in return, listen, do you understand what is happening to India when the epicenter of terror is inside Pakistan, and you don't seem to understand what's going on. We've had an attack in Mumbai in which 160 odd people were killed, and including some Americans. Now, I think so. I think we will both will have to leave it at that. They will sort of kiss and make up on several other issues.
Can I draw a corollary out of what you're saying? Mr. Modi criticized the division and distinction between good and bad terror, but you're suggesting he can make a different distinction between terror that's next door to us and matters, Pakistan, and terror that's a little further away, and I can afford not to go public about ISIL.
But isn't that what Atal Bihari Vajpayee said in 2003 when then George Bush,
but isn't there a hypocrisy in saying don't split between good and bad, but split between what's near and what's far?
No, listen, it's about national interest. I mean, this terror is far more interesting to us. And remember what...
National interest also leads to good and bad, doesn't it? Someone else's national interest.
But listen, remember what Modi told Fareed Zakaria when he asked him about Ukraine. Modi, by the way, refused to criticize the Russians on Ukraine. And this was, Fareed Zakaria wanted him to come on board the American sort of campaign on Ukraine.
Is that going to be the real problem? That at the end of the day, when you look through the eloquent words claiming high principle, how they perceive terror, it depends upon how they perceive their national interest. And at the end of the day, Mr. Modi may criticize them for good and bad, but if we come up with terror that's near to us, that matters, and terror that's further away that we can ignore, then we're also making a similar distinction that's equally criticizable.
I think neither of us has monopoly on hypocrisy. I think in international relations everyone is hypocritical. But I think on terrorism, look, I don't think anyone is putting pressure on us to join the anti-ISIL coalition. I think what you're going to see in the joint statement that's going to come out in a couple of hours, expanded India-US security cooperation.
You've seen the joint statement, have you?
No, I mean, I can guess it, but that's what you're going to see in Afghanistan, in Pakistan.
Or prescient? A bit of astrology over there.
Probably.
Very quickly, because time's running out, Mr. Sheshasai, do you believe that in the area of defense we could see what the press calls deliverables? The Hindustan Times talked about 34 state-of-the-art weapon systems that the Pentagon wishes to sell, which India is keen to buy, and that doesn't necessarily involve private sector companies at this stage. Do you think, therefore, defense could be one area where the two governments come up with significant agreements? A quick answer.
The agreement is going to be renewed.
Yes, I think this is in the natural interest of the parties concerned. It's bound to happen. But slightly tangentially, I think if we are looking for a defense industry to take roots in India, manufacturing to take place and jobs getting created and defense equipment being done by American companies for the world at large, then I think we've got to change the structure in which we expect that to happen.
You mean 49% is simply not sufficient? If you want to entice them, you have to give them a bigger share of the cake.
That's not sufficient.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, but that's my personal opinion.
I think so. We have to creep up to it. I'm sure the government is alive to that.
Well, if it is alive to it, is making a pretty good case of not wanting to heed it, because the government is adamant that they're not going to go above 49% if the last words heard from the finance minister when he first announced that policy can be taken as the final words. But maybe Mr. Modi will come back from America with a different answer. At the end of the day, Mr. Modi is the Prime Minister, and what he says goes. We're going to have to leave this particular episode there. My thanks to all three of my friends for joining me. We will be back tomorrow with the former Foreign Minister of the last government, Salman Khurshid, placing on record for the first time his view and his party's view on the Modi visit. Does Congress believe Mr. Modi has scored and scored well, or does Congress have reservations? Join me tomorrow at this time to find out. But for tonight, goodbye, good night.